Thanks for joining me, everyone. So, what is socialism? I think it's a question that is worthy of asking right now, given that recent polls indicate that younger Democrats in this country, millennial age voters and people coming of age, increasingly support socialism and just elected a nominee from Queens, that being Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is an open and avowed socialist. Of course, she calls herself a quote unquote democratic socialist, which I think is, a very convoluted elocution. It's a turn of phrase. I mean, I've seen blogger, YouTuber David Pakman doing programs about the difference between democratic socialism and socialism. There really, I would argue, are none that are major. Democratic socialism, I mean, you put the word socialism as the main word there. It's a democratic as a description. And it works similar to National Socialism, which is a description of socialism. It's a type of socialism. But the main key there is socialism. And, the description is more of a nuanced attempt to try to describe and maybe even obfuscate the fact that we are talking about socialism. Now, a guest of mine here at the Morse Force, that being Professor Crispin Sartwell from Dickinson University, just got a very interesting column published in the Wall Street Journal where he asks young people to consider the fact that if socialism came about in this country, it would give an enormous amount of power to the executive, that being President Donald Trump. Do they really want to have Donald Trump be in charge of all of these massive increases in power that socialism advocates? And that's an interesting little thought, although I would suggest that Donald Trump is less likely to have to exercise those powers than would be a Barack Obama or somebody that's more of a socialistic and authoritarian orientation. But nevertheless, that's beside the point. The fact is that socialism is, quote, public ownership of the means of production. That's the dictionary definition. Public ownership of the means of production, public ownership of the means of communication, public ownership of the means of distribution. In other words, public ownership of as many aspects of the life of the citizen as possible. That's what socialism is. And the term public, of course, is a euphemism for the state, because the state, in the socialist theory, acts as the vehicle, the active agent to bring about ultimate socialism. The state is Obama talked about this when he saw the government as affecting change. What he meant by change was moving more toward an authoritarian and I would suggest socialistic modality where there is a bigger nanny state. There is more government control over the means of production. The National Socialist model of Germany under Hitler, who started out by many indicators as a communist, was public ownership of the means of healthcare, public ownership of welfare, public ownership of education, public ownership of policing on a national level, what the Nazis called the Gestapo, and other modalities. I mean, the government would favor certain groups over others in the interest of moving the society forward, and they would condemn other groups. In the case of the National Socialists, that meant condemning Jews and praising this mythical group called the Aryans. In the United States, a more National Socialist model might mean praising, Black people, gay people, Hispanics, and condemning white men. I'm not suggesting that be the case. I'm simply pointing out that that's public ownership of the mode of production. That's public ownership of the mode of communication and distribution. The public owns these rights. They emanate from this quote unquote public. And again, public is a euphemism for the state, the government. The government acts as the agent of the public. How it arrives at that is not named. I suppose a democratic socialism, a democracy in ancient Greece was simply majority rule. In ancient Athens, people would raise their hand, and the more hands up, that's what would go. So, of course, in this country, we don't have a democracy. We have a republic, which means that we protect the minority. We protect the group that doesn't have a majority vote. And of course, the most vulnerable of all minorities, which is something that was pointed out by Ayn Rand, is the individual, the most vulnerable, the most easy to take away rights from because they're standing alone. So we don't have a democracy. We're a republic that's based upon democratic principles, but we are a republic that protects the right of the individual citizen and the minority against the mob, the majority, and that we live under a set of laws that we call the Constitution, not under the arbitrary rule of individuals who get to decide what is best for us. And of course, in a socialistic system, the system operates under a group of elitist, so-called enlightened people, people who are smarter than us, who get to decide things because they know better than us. And the state, again, being, quote, the public or acting in as a surrogate for the public, is a temporary thing. I mean, Karl Marx described the ultimate state, the utopian state, as a condition by which human society would no longer need government. He had a word for that, and that word was communism. Communism, the word and the concept existed before Marx, but Marx grafted it into his theory and said that after a long dialectical process of political and social evolution, man would reach a point where they would no longer need government. He referred to government as something that would wither away, as he wrote. And that in order to reach that point, man would have to give up or be taken from entities and institutions and ideas that prevented the system from coming to being. And those were things that created inequality, things like religion, things like private property, money, the right to trade goods and services, faith, family, loyalty, and ultimately the individual identity themselves, because the fact is that we are not all equal. We can never be equal. We can never be made equal. We're all different. We have equal rights under the law, of course. That's a Republican idea. But we are free operators. We are, I'm never going to be as good a baseball player as Carl Yastrzemski was. I'm never going to be as good a scientist as Albert Einstein. I mean, we all have different skills that we bring to the table, and we're all different. Nobody's equal. There's no such thing as equality. There's only equal rights under the law. So you have a situation where the international socialists view the state as operating as, quote, the public, with eventually the withering away of the state, while the National Socialists, the Nazis, they tended to revere the state as the end-all. The state power, it comes from the concepts, Hegel wrote about this in his dialectical writings. He had actually coined the term dialectic, where he viewed the state as possessing almost divine powers. He didn't say how that happened, but that the state was an organic entity that the individual would have to become an appendage of, that individual identity would be sublimated to the state. It was a concept that was advanced by German philosopher Oswald Spengler, who actually wrote about the state as having an organic life, like a birth, adolescence, adulthood, and decline and eventual death. And of course, the ultimate manifestation of this theory was the Nazis themselves, who viewed the state as somehow divinely mandated to transform human nature by dominating over peoples who were lesser than the designated group. And of course, in case of Germany, that would have been Germans, or as they called them, Aryans. And in Japan, it would have been the Japanese. So, they would each have their spheres, and they would each dominate and work together. I would suggest that ultimately the Nazi socialist idea was like the communist idea, in that ultimately they did view the end of the need for the state. When man would live in perfect harmony with nature, there'd be no need for government. We would all become lobotomized ants in an international ant colony. No more property, no more individual identity, no more faith, no more family, or no more of any of these things that Karl Marx called false consciousness, things that were made up by this conspiracy on the part of the bourgeoisie to exploit working people. In fact, the entire Marxist entity is based on this vast conspiracy theory. And this is why you find leftists very much having a conspiratorial view of the world. Anyone that isn't part of the state is, like a business, for example, or a farm or an individual, they're all ripping you off. They're all exploiting you. You talk to a leftist about this and you'll find this to be the case. So anyways, that's a brief primer on what socialism is. It's an idea that runs completely contrary to American notions of freedom. I hope that young people who think they're socialists take a good look at it and wonder, first of all, how would they actually do in a socialist country like, let's say, Venezuela, right? If they had to go to Venezuela and live there without their bourgeois capitalist income and money and exploited capital, but just had to live there like anyone else, how long would they last? Probably no more than 5 minutes. But more philosophically, is this really what they want? They want to turn over their lives, their property, their identity, ultimately, their freedoms to some kind of a nebulous public owner, a state, and sacrifice themselves to that and trust them to somehow make it a better world? There's not going to be a better world under those conditions. The idea of wanting to have a better world and create a better universe, that's a good and positive and natural element of humanity. That's part of who we are. Doesn't mean everyone wants to do it or will do it or actualize it, but there is something about being alive as a human being that you want to improve your environment. You want to teach. You want to impart ideas that you think will improve life. That's a given, but you have to be free to do that in order to really make a difference. You can't transfer that power to this, quote, public, this state to do it, so you don't have to do anything, which makes me think that maybe this whole business of younger people wanting to be socialists, it's easy, it's lazy. You don't have to feel like you have to do anything. Socialists usually don't do much to make anything better. They hope the state does it. They transfer it to the state, and they feel that if they just mouth a few platitudes that indicate their support for this sort of thing, somehow that is doing something, when it really isn't. It's hurting people. Anyway, so those are my brief thoughts. That is how I see socialism. Check out my books. They're available at Amazon.com. My name is Chuck Morse, Morse. Thanks for watching, everybody.